Don't trust him, sir." The girl's voice was so quiet that Harrison Vale nearly missed it beneath the low hum of the boardroom's ventilation, and the soft click of his own gold cufflink against the leather armrest of the chair he had just pulled out to sit down in. He was standing at the head of the long walnut table on the 42nd floor of Vale Industries Tower, a black leather portfolio open in his left hand, a Mont Blanc fountain pen already uncapped in his right. He was 71 years old. He had signed roughly 9,000 contracts in his life, and he had been about to sign the largest one of them all in exactly 4 minutes. He turned slowly. The girl was standing beside the long credenza against the north wall, half hidden behind the tall arrangement of white orchids that the assistant to the assistant of his executive assistant arranged fresh in the boardroom every Monday morning. She was perhaps 9 years old, maybe 10, in a navy skirt that had been ironed carefully by someone who cared very much about how she looked in this building, and a white blouse with a small collar that had been buttoned all the way to the top. She was holding a folded stack of paper napkins in one hand and an empty water pitcher in the other. She had been refilling the crystal glasses along the table, the way her mother had shown her to do it, quietly, without meeting anyone's eyes, walking around the outside of the room in the small, careful loop that staff were expected to walk when the men at the table were preparing to make decisions worth more money than most people would ever see. Harrison recognized her after a moment. Her mother was Nadine Whittaker, who had worked in the executive services division of Vale Industries for 11 years, and who once every 3 or 4 months, when the school district had a professional day and the after-school program was closed, brought her daughter to the office and sat her in the small break room down the hall with a coloring book and a juice box and a strict, whispered instruction to be invisible. Harrison had walked past her in that break room perhaps 6 times over the years. He had once, on a Christmas morning when he had come in to sign a bonus authorization, given her a chocolate orange in a red foil wrapper from the basket on his assistant's desk. She had thanked him with the small formal thank you of a child who had been raised to know exactly how to receive a gift from a man who owned the building she was standing in. He had never learned her name. "What did you say?" he asked. She did not look away. There was fear in her face, but it was the small, controlled fear of a child who had already weighed the cost of speaking and had decided that the cost of not speaking was worse. Her hands did not tremble on the pitcher. Her chin did not drop. "Don't trust him, sir," she said again. "The man in the gray suit, the one who was just in here. Please don't sign whatever he's asking you to sign until you look at page 11. Harrison Vale set the fountain pen down on the leather blotter in front of him. He did it slowly, the way he had learned to do everything slowly in rooms where a quick movement could cost more than a house. He was the founder and chief executive of Vale Industries, a diversified holding company whose subsidiaries operated in 14 countries and employed just over 62,000 people. He had been threatened, sued, subpoenaed, audited, and in 1994 briefly kidnapped from the back of a town car in Sao Paulo. He had never in any of those moments been told not to trust someone by a 9-year-old girl standing behind a vase of orchids in his own boardroom. He looked at the closed door at the far end of the room. Beyond it, in the mahogany-paneled anteroom, the man in the gray suit, Douglas Merrick, his chief financial officer of 19 years, was pouring himself a cup of coffee from the silver service and speaking in a low, easy voice with 2 of the outside directors. In 4 minutes he would walk back through that door carrying the closing binder for the acquisition of Halbrook Logistics, a transaction Harrison had negotiated personally over 18 months and was scheduled to sign at 10 o'clock precisely. Harrison turned back to the girl. "Come here a moment," he said, in the calm, unhurried voice he reserved for negotiations that mattered. "Don't be afraid. Walk slowly. What is your name?" "Amara, sir," she said. "Amara Whittaker." Amara Whittaker set the empty water pitcher down on the credenza with the small, deliberate care of a child who had been told all her life that things in this building broke expensively. She kept the stack of paper napkins folded in her hand. She walked around the long end of the walnut table toward Harrison Vale in the quiet steps that her mother had taught her to walk in on the marble floors of the 42nd floor. When she was perhaps 4 feet away from him, she stopped. She did not come closer than that. She had been taught not to. Harrison studied her. He had built his fortune on reading faces across tables, and he had learned young that the face of a child under pressure told the truth more reliably than the face of any adult he had ever negotiated with. Amara's face was still. Her eyes were dark and steady. There was a small line of tension at the corner of her mouth, the kind a person gets when they have been holding something inside for longer than a child ought to have to hold anything. "Amara," he said quietly, "how did you come to be in this room this morning?" "My mama sent me to help refill the water, sir. Ms. Delaney called down and said the pitchers were low, and Mama was on a call, and I asked if I could do it. She said yes because it's a small job, and I've done it twice before when nothing important was happening." "And how did you come to hear something today that made you decide to speak to me?" The girl hesitated. She glanced once toward the closed door. It was the small reflexive glance of a child who had been raised to know that whatever she said next could cost her mother the job that paid for the small apartment they shared 11 miles from the tower. Then she seemed to decide something, the same something Harrison had seen deciding in the faces of grown men and women across tables when they realized that not speaking was going to cost more than speaking. She met his eyes. "I was in here about 20 minutes ago, sir, filling the pitchers before the meeting started. The man in the gray suit came in early. He didn't see me because I was behind the orchids reaching for the one at the end. He was on the phone. He was talking quiet, but I could hear him because I was right there. He said, 'The old man signs at 10. Page 11 is the one that matters. Once his signature is on it, we're clear.' Then he laughed, sir, not a nice laugh, and he said he hasn't read a closing binder cover to cover in 6 years. He'll sign whatever we put in front of him." Harrison Vale did not move. He stood at the head of the long table with his left hand still resting on the open portfolio, and his right hand now empty and flat against the leather blotter beside the fountain pen he had set down. He was aware, in the small precise way that a man becomes aware of certain things when a room he thought he understood has just rearranged itself around him, that the girl was telling the truth. He was also aware, in the same precise way, that she was correct in what she had overheard. He had not read a closing binder cover to cover in 6 years. He had been signing on the strength of Douglas Merrick's summaries since the summer of 2019, when his eyes had begun to trouble him after the second surgery, and Douglas had, with great and touching solicitude, offered to prepare a 1-page executive brief on every transaction so that Harrison would not have to strain them further. He had thanked Douglas at the time. He had considered it a small kindness. He had told his daughter about it over dinner the following weekend as an example of the quiet loyalty of long service. "Amara," he said, his voice was very calm, "I want you to tell me one more thing, and I want you to take your time answering it. Are you absolutely certain of the words you just repeated to me? Not the general idea, the exact words. Page 11 is the one that matters. Once his signature is on it, we're clear." "Did he say those words in that order?" "Yes, sir." "You are certain?" "I am certain, sir. I remembered them all the way down the hall because I knew as soon as he said them that they were the kind of words a person should remember." Harrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done in the boardroom in 19 years. He pulled out the chair beside his own, the chair traditionally reserved for the chief financial officer, and he gestured to it. "Sit down, Amara." Amara Whittaker looked at the chair. She looked at Harrison Vale. She looked at the closed door at the far end of the room. Then she looked back at the chair, and Harrison could see her working through in her small, careful head the question of whether sitting in that particular chair, at that particular table, in a navy skirt her mother had ironed at 6 o'clock that morning, was the kind of thing a girl like her was permitted to do even when the man who owned the building was telling her she could. "It's all right," Harrison said quietly. "This morning it is your chair. Sit down." She sat. She sat the way a child sits at a piano recital, both feet flat on the floor, both hands folded in her lap on top of the stack of paper napkins, her back not touching the leather of the chair behind her. Harrison remained standing. He walked slowly around the head of the table until he was standing behind his own chair with both hands resting on its back, and he looked down the long, polished length of the walnut toward the closed door. He had 4 minutes. He now had somewhere between 3.5 and 3 minutes. He turned back to the girl. "Amara, I am going to ask you to do something else for me. It is going to feel strange. I want you to sit in that chair exactly as you are sitting now, and I want you not to speak unless I ask you a direct question. When the men come back into this room, I want you to look at your hands. Do not look at the man in the gray suit. Do not look at me. Look at your hands the way you were taught to look at your hands when there are important people in the room. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "If anyone asks you what you are doing at this table, you will say, 'Mr. Vale asked me to sit here.' You will say nothing else, not one word more. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good." He walked to the wall behind the credenza. There was a small brass panel set into the walnut paneling at shoulder height, no larger than a pack of cards, that no one who had not built the room would ever notice. Harrison pressed it. It clicked. A slim, recessed intercom slid forward on a spring mechanism. He lifted the handset. "Ms. Delaney." The voice on the other end belonged to Corinne Delaney, who had been his executive assistant for 24 years, and who was at that moment sitting at her desk in the anteroom 12 feet from Douglas Merrick. She answered in the neutral, pleasant voice she used when she was being watched. "Yes, Mr. Vale." "Ms. Delaney, please listen carefully and do not react to what I am about to say. I need you to do 4 things. First, I need you to walk to the ladies' room. Do not stop to speak with anyone. Once you are inside the ladies' room, I need you to call Mr. Sutherland on his mobile, not on the office line. Tell him I need him in the boardroom in 10 minutes with the original closing binder, the one that was couriered from Halbrook's counsel last Thursday and locked in the vault on the 38th floor, not the working copy that has been circulating this week. The original." "Yes, Mr. Vale." "Second, I need you to call the head of internal audit, Ms. Kwan, and ask her to come to the boardroom immediately with a laptop and 2 forensic accountants. Tell her it is a matter of the highest urgency and that she is to enter through the private corridor, not the main reception." "Yes, Mr. Vale." "Third, I need you to call downstairs to Nadine Whitaker in Executive Services. Tell her that her daughter Amara is with me and that she is completely safe and is helping me with a small matter. Ask Nadine to come up to the boardroom as well through the private corridor. She is not in any trouble. I want her to know that immediately." "Yes, Mr. Vale." "Fourth, when you return to your desk, I would like you to continue behaving as if nothing has happened. Offer Mr. Merrick another cup of coffee. Smile at him. Ask about his weekend. Buy me 10 minutes. Can you do that?" There was the small pause that Harrison had heard in Corinne Delaney's voice perhaps 4 times in 24 years. It was the pause of a woman who had just understood, without being told, exactly what she was being asked to help him do. "Yes, Mr. Vale, I can do that." "Thank you, Corinne." He set the handset down. He turned back to the girl at the table. She was sitting exactly as he had instructed her to sit. She was looking at her hands. Harrison Vale walked back to the head of the table and stood behind his chair. He did not sit. He rested his hands on the leather at the top of the chairback, and he looked down at the closed portfolio and the uncapped fountain pen and the small stack of documents that had been set out for him that morning by the man in the gray suit. He had exactly 9 minutes before the door would open, if his count was right, and he had a great many things to do inside those 9 minutes. The first thing he did was pick up the closing binder Douglas Merrick had left in front of his chair, and he opened it to page 11. He read it slowly. He had, as the girl had correctly overheard, not read a closing binder cover to cover in 6 years. His eyes were not what they had been. The type on the page was small and dense, and set in the peculiar cramped column format that transactional lawyers used when they wanted a document to look thorough without being easy to follow. Harrison reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and drew out the small pair of reading glasses that his daughter had made him promise to carry at all times, and he settled them on his nose, and he read page 11 twice. The first time, He read it the way he had read every page of every binder in the last 6 years, which was to say quickly, with the practiced skimming of a man who had learned to trust the summaries prepared for him by the people he had chosen to trust. The second time, he read it the way he had read documents in the years before he had begun to trust anyone at all. Page 11 of the closing binder for the acquisition of Halbrook Logistics was, on its face, a standard indemnification clause. It ran to 41 lines of tightly spaced legal text, and it appeared to describe, in the ordinary careful language of such clauses, the allocation of certain liabilities arising from environmental remediation obligations at 3 of Halbrook's terminal facilities on the Gulf Coast. Harrison had personally negotiated those liabilities down over 4 months of correspondence with Halbrook's outside counsel. He remembered the numbers. He remembered the terminals. He remembered the particular Tuesday in January when Halbrook's chief executive had agreed on a call to cap the assumed liability at $18 million. The clause on page 11 capped the assumed liability at $180 million. Harrison read the number 3 times. He held the binder very still in his hands. He was aware, in the small precise way that a man in his position becomes aware of certain things, that a decimal point had been moved. He was also aware that a decimal point does not move by itself in a closing binder that had been through the review of the chief financial officer of a company the size of Vail Industries. A decimal point in that position, in that clause, in that binder, on a Monday morning at 10 o'clock, had been moved by a person who intended it to be moved, and who had reason to believe that no one at the head of the table would notice. Harrison closed the binder. He set it down carefully in exactly the position on the leather blotter that Douglas Merrick had left it in. He aligned the fountain pen beside it at exactly the angle it had been aligned at. He took a small step back from the chair and looked at the arrangement, and he was satisfied that a man walking back into the room in 6 or 7 minutes would see nothing that suggested the binder had been opened at all. Then he walked around the long side of the table until he was standing beside the girl. He did not sit. He rested one hand very gently on the back of the chair beside hers. "Amara," he said quietly, "you just saved this company $162 million. I want you to remember that number. I am not going to explain it to you now. I am going to explain it to you later, over a very good lunch in a room where nobody is going to interrupt us. But I want you to remember the number." She looked up at him. She did not smile. She was not the kind of child he was beginning to understand who smiled at compliments from adults she did not yet know whether she could trust. "Yes, sir," she said, $162 million. That is correct." He walked back to the head of the table. He picked up the fountain pen. He weighed it in his hand the way a man weighs a familiar tool before he uses it for something unfamiliar. Then he set it back down in exactly the position Douglas Merrick had left it in, and he went to wait behind his chair for the door to open. The private corridor door opened first. It opened the way the private corridor door was designed to open, which was to say silently, on hinges that had been engineered in Switzerland in 1978, for a man who had wanted a way in and out of his own boardroom that did not require walking past his own assistant. Corinne Delaney had never used it. In 24 years, she had never once had reason to walk through it. She walked through it now. She came in with the small, controlled steps of a woman who had been running a floor of a Fortune 200 company for a quarter of a century, and who was, at this particular moment, running the most important 10 minutes of that quarter century. Behind her walked Nadine Whittaker in the pale gray uniform of the Executive Services Division, and behind Nadine walked a tall, calm woman in a dark suit whom Harrison recognized as Priya Kwan, the head of internal audit, carrying a slim silver laptop under one arm. 2 younger people in slightly less expensive suits followed Priya, each of them carrying laptop cases and the small, alert expression of forensic accountants who had been told very little and had understood a great deal. Nadine Whittaker saw her daughter at the boardroom table and stopped in the doorway. She did not cry out. She did not rush forward. She simply stopped, and Harrison saw pass across her face in the space of perhaps 2 seconds the entire private cost of 11 years of working in a building that could take everything from her on any given Monday morning without warning. Then she saw her daughter's small folded hands on top of the stack of paper napkins, and she saw that her daughter was sitting up straight in the chair the way she had been taught to sit up straight, and she saw Harrison Vale standing behind his own chair at the head of the table with the small, watchful stillness of a man who was protecting something. Nadine Whittaker's shoulders dropped perhaps half an inch. "Nadine," Harrison said quietly, "please come in. Close the door behind you. Your daughter is not in any trouble. She has, in fact, done something extraordinary this morning, and I am going to spend a considerable amount of time in the coming weeks making sure you both understand exactly how extraordinary. For now, I need you to trust me for the next 15 minutes without asking any questions. Can you do that?" Nadine Whittaker looked at her daughter. Her daughter looked back at her and gave one small nod, the nod of a child telling her mother across a room that she was safe. "Yes, Mr. Vale," Nadine said. "Thank you. Please stand beside your daughter. Ms. Kwan, please come to the head of the table. Bring the laptop. Your accountants may set up on the credenza. We have approximately 6 minutes." Priya Kwan crossed the room without a word. She had worked at Vale Industries for 9 years, and she had worked at 3 other companies before that. And in all 4 of those companies she had learned that, when the founder of the enterprise asked for 6 minutes in a voice that low, the correct response was to give him 6 minutes and to save all questions for later. She set the silver laptop on the walnut and opened it. She looked at Harrison. "Ms. Kwan," Harrison said, "I need you to pull up the file for the Halbrook Logistics acquisition, the working file, not the archive, the one the finance team has been circulating for internal review over the last 3 weeks. Priya's fingers moved on the keyboard. The file opened. She turned the laptop so Harrison could see the screen. "Page 11 of the closing binder," Harrison said. "The indemnification clause. Please read the cap on assumed environmental liability aloud." Priya read. $180 million, she said. "Ms. Kwan, please pull up the version of that same clause that was in the file 8 weeks ago, before the red line review by outside counsel. If it is not in your archive, tell me now." Priya's fingers moved again. She was silent for perhaps 12 seconds. Then she looked up at Harrison, and her face did the thing that faces do when a person who has been trained for a decade to be difficult to surprise has just been surprised. $18 million, she said. "Ms. Kwan, please pull up the version that was in the file 4 weeks ago. $18 million. 2 weeks ago. $18 million. 1 week ago." Priya's fingers moved more slowly. She was checking each entry against the audit trail with the precise attention of a person who had just realized that everything she had ever built her career on was being tested inside the next 30 seconds. She looked up. $18 million. "When did the number change, Ms. Kwan?" Priya read the timestamp on the file. 6:41 this morning, she said. "The file was checked out and back in from Mr. Merrick's workstation." Harrison Vale nodded once, very slowly. He had known, in the small, precise way that he had known certain things for the last 11 minutes, that Priya Kwan was going to say exactly those words in exactly that order. He had needed to hear them anyway. There was a difference between a thing a man believed on the word of a 9-year-old girl, and a thing a man had watched his own head of internal audit read off the timestamp of a corporate file, and the difference was the exact difference that a court of law would one day be asked to consider. He turned to Priya. "Ms. Kwan, in the next 3 minutes, Mr. Merrick is going to walk through that door with the closing binder in his hand. He is going to sit down in the chair Amara Whittaker is currently sitting in, which he will find surprising. He is going to attempt to move the meeting along at the pace he has planned. I need you to sit at the credenza with your accountants, and I need you to say nothing until I ask you a direct question. When I ask you the question, I want you to answer it exactly the way you just answered me, timestamp included. Can you do that?" "Yes, Mr. Vale." Corrine Delaney turned from the doorway where she had been standing very still. "Yes, Mr. Vale. Please send Mr. Sutherland into the room the moment he arrives with the original closing binder. Do not announce him. Simply open the private corridor door and let him walk in. He will understand. Yes, Mr. Vale. When Mr. Merrick and the outside directors return from the anteroom, please seat the directors in their usual chairs. When Mr. Merrick asks you why the room is arranged the way it is arranged, please tell him, in the pleasantest voice you can manage, that I asked for the arrangement personally and that I will explain it when the meeting begins. Do not answer any other questions. Yes, Mr. Vale. Nadine. Nadine Whittaker straightened beside her daughter's chair. She had not moved since Harrison had told her to stand there. Yes, Mr. Vale. In about 4 minutes, this room is going to become uncomfortable. It is not going to become dangerous. I want to be very clear about that. No one is going to raise a voice. No one is going to threaten anyone. This is not that kind of room. But it is going to become uncomfortable for one particular person, and Amara is going to be sitting 6 feet from that person while it happens. I would like you to remain standing exactly where you are standing now. If at any point Amara looks up at you, I would like you to nod at her the way you just nodded at her from the doorway. That is all I need from you. Can you do that? Yes, Mr. Vale. Thank you. Harrison walked back to his own chair at the head of the table. He did not sit. He stood behind it with his hands resting lightly on the leather at the top of the chairback, and he looked down the long, polished length of the walnut toward the closed door at the far end of the room. He had approximately 2 minutes. He used them. He used the first 30 seconds to think about his wife, Vivian, who had died 4 years earlier and who had once, in a small conversation in the garden of their house in Connecticut, told him that the trouble with running an empire was that the empire eventually began to run itself, and that when it did, the men who had been standing quietly in the corners for a long time began to make small decisions on his behalf that he would not have made if he had been paying attention. He had laughed at the time. He had asked her which men she meant. She had said, "You will know when you know, and I hope for your sake that you find out from someone who has nothing to gain from telling you." He used the next 30 seconds to think about the fact that the person who had told him had a stack of paper napkins folded in her lap and had never in her life been inside a room like this one before this morning. He used the next 30 seconds to think about Douglas Merrick, whom he had hired in the summer of 2007 out of a mid-sized investment bank, and whom he had promoted 3 times in 19 years, and whose 2 children he had put through college on a scholarship program he had personally endowed at their request. He thought about the Christmas parties. He thought about the wedding of Douglas's older daughter, at which Harrison had given a short toast about the meaning of long partnership. He thought about the summer weekend in 2019 when Douglas had, with such touching solicitude, offered to prepare a 1-page summary of every closing binder. Then he used the last 30 seconds to prepare his face. The main door opened at exactly 9:59 and 42 seconds. Douglas Merrick came in first, carrying the closing binder in his left hand and a fresh cup of coffee in his right, with the small, easy smile that he had used for 19 years to enter rooms that he considered his own. Behind him walked the 2 outside directors, Charles Ashford and Marguerite Carlson, both of whom Harrison had known for more than 20 years and both of whom he had, in the last 4 minutes, come to the reluctant conclusion he would need to watch very carefully for the rest of the morning. Behind them walked the 2 younger executives from the corporate development team, whose names Harrison could remember on other mornings and could not remember on this one, and whose role in the meeting was to nod at the appropriate moments and to be photographed later shaking hands with the Halbrook delegation. Douglas Merrick was 3 paces into the room before he saw the girl in the chief financial officer's chair. He stopped. His face did not change. This was the first thing Harrison noticed and would remember later as the small, precise moment when he understood that the man he had trusted for 19 years had done this kind of thing before. A person who had not done this kind of thing before would have flinched. Douglas Merrick did not flinch. His face simply held its pleasant meeting room expression for 1 beat longer than a person's face naturally holds any expression, and then he smiled a slightly wider smile and he turned that smile toward Harrison. "Harrison," he said, I see we have a small guest this morning. Yes, Douglas, we do. Please come in. Close the door. Douglas Merrick closed the door. He did not walk to his chair. He stood beside it in the small, courteous pause of a man deciding how to handle a situation he had not planned for, and Harrison watched him decide. And Harrison watched him land on the decision that this was a small oddity of the founders, the kind of thing that 71-year-old billionaires sometimes did on Monday mornings, and that it would resolve itself in the next 30 seconds if he simply waited politely. "Amara," Harrison said quietly, "would you please stand up and move to the chair beside your mother? Take your time. Bring your napkins with you." Amara Whitaker stood. She picked up the small, folded stack of napkins from where she had set them on the walnut. She walked around the outside of the table in the same quiet loop she had been trained to walk in, and she stopped beside her mother against the north wall, and she folded her hands in front of her exactly the way she had been folding them for the last 11 minutes. Douglas Merrick sat down in his chair. He set the closing binder on the leather blotter in front of him with the practiced grace of a man who had set a great many closing binders on a great many blotters. He set the coffee cup precisely 3 inches to the right of the binder. He smiled at Harrison. "Shall we begin?" "In a moment, Douglas. First, I would like to introduce a small change in the agenda. Ms. Kwan from Internal Audit is going to join us this morning. Ms. Kwan, please come to the table." Priya Kwan stood from the credenza and walked to the table. She sat in the chair beside Douglas Merrick without making eye contact with him. She set her silver laptop on the walnut and opened it. Her 2 forensic accountants remained at the credenza and did not look up from their screens. Douglas Merrick's face held its meeting room expression. "Priya," he said pleasantly, "I wasn't aware you were joining us today. Is there a compliance matter?" "There is, Mr. Merrick," Priya said. Her voice was very even. Harrison did not sit. He remained standing behind his chair, and he looked down the table at Douglas Merrick, and he spoke in the calm, unhurried voice he had used with the girl 15 minutes earlier. "Douglas, before we begin the signing, I would like to ask you a question. It is a small question, and it will take you very little time to answer. In the closing binder in front of you, on page 11, there is a cap on assumed environmental liability at the 3 Halbrook terminals on the Gulf Coast. What is that cap?" Douglas Merrick did not open the binder. He looked at Harrison across the length of the walnut for the small, measured moment that a man uses when he is deciding, in real time, whether to lie in a room he is no longer certain of. Harrison watched him decide. He watched Douglas Merrick land on the decision that the founder was 71 and had not read a closing binder in 6 years, and that the correct answer to the question was the answer that had been rehearsed. $18 million, Harrison, as we agreed with Halbrook in January. Harrison nodded slowly. "Ms. Kwan, what is the cap on page 11 of the binder in front of Mr. Merrick, as it currently reads?" Priya turned the laptop. $180 million, she said. Douglas Merrick's face did not change. This, too, Harrison would remember. It was the second thing that told him with absolute certainty what he was looking at. A man who had made an honest mistake would have opened the binder. A man who had made an honest mistake would have flipped to page 11 with the quick, embarrassed movements of a professional caught in a clerical error. And he would have read the clause aloud. And he would have said, with the appropriate note of horror, that he had no idea how the number had gotten there. That the version he had reviewed on Friday had said 18 million. That someone in outside counsel's office must have introduced the change over the weekend. That he would personally get to the bottom of it before the end of the day. Douglas Merrick did none of those things. He looked at Priya Kwan for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he looked at Harrison. Then he smiled the small, pleasant smile of a man who had decided, in the space of those 2 seconds, that the situation was recoverable if he handled the next 60 seconds with sufficient calm. "Harrison," he said, "I think there must be some confusion with the file versions. The working copy in front of me is the one that came back from outside counsel on Friday afternoon. If Ms. Kwan is looking at an earlier draft, that would certainly explain a discrepancy. Why don't we take a short recess? I'll pull the correct version from my office and we can reconvene in 20 minutes. He began to stand. Sit down, Douglas. Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had been running rooms like this one for 46 years, and he had learned very young that the men who raised their voices in rooms like this were the men who did not yet understand what a room like this was for. Douglas Merrick sat down. The private corridor door opened again. Nigel Sutherland walked in. He was Vale Industries' general counsel, a small, tidy man in a navy suit who had joined the company in 2011 and who had never in Harrison's memory been asked to enter the boardroom through the private corridor. He was carrying a black leather binder embossed with the Halbrook Logistics seal, and he was carrying it with both hands the way a person carries something that has been kept in a vault. He walked to the head of the table without speaking and set the binder down in front of Harrison's chair. The original, Mr. Vale, retrieved from the 38th floor vault at 9:48 and logged out under my signature. The seal is intact. Thank you, Nigel. Please remain in the room. Sit at the credenza. Nigel Sutherland sat at the credenza beside the two forensic accountants. He did not look at Douglas Merrick. He had, Harrison understood in the small, precise way that he had understood a great many things in the last 20 minutes, understood already what he was in the room for. Harrison opened the sealed binder. He turned to page 11. He read the clause aloud, in the clear, steady voice he had used to read from documents in this room for 4 decades. Notwithstanding the foregoing, the buyer's aggregate liability for environmental remediation obligations arising at or in respect of the terminal facilities identified in Schedule 4.7 shall not exceed $18 million in the aggregate, such cap to survive the closing for a period of 48 months. He closed the sealed binder. He looked down the length of the walnut at Douglas Merrick. Douglas, he said quietly, the binder in front of you is not the binder that was couriered from Halbrook's counsel on Thursday. The binder in front of you was modified on your workstation at 6:41 this morning. The cap on page 11 of your binder is $180 million. The cap on page 11 of the sealed original is $18 million. That is a difference of $162 million, which is the exact amount you appear to have arranged to have flow, on my signature, into a liability reserve account that I am quite certain, when Ms. Kwan and her team follow the wiring instructions on the signature page, will trace to a party in which you have an undisclosed personal interest. The room was very quiet. Charles Ashford, the outside director, had gone the color of old paper. Marguerite Carlson was looking at Douglas Merrick with the expression of a woman who was, in real time, revising her understanding of the last 19 years of board meetings. Douglas Merrick did not speak. Harrison Vale continued in the same quiet voice. Before you say anything, Douglas, I would like you to understand 3 things. First, the reason I know what is on page 11 this morning is not because I read the binder. I did not read the binder. I have not read a full closing binder in 6 years, as you correctly observed on the telephone in this room at approximately 9:38 this morning. Douglas Merrick's face finally changed. It changed in the small, precise way that faces change when a person has just understood, in one clean instant, that the room he thought he was in is not the room he is in. He looked at Harrison. He looked at Priya Kwan. He looked at Nigel Sutherland at the credenza. Then, in a moment Harrison would remember for the rest of his life, Douglas Merrick's eyes moved along the north wall until they landed on the small figure of a 9-year-old girl in a navy skirt, standing beside her mother with her hands folded in front of her. And he understood in that same clean instant exactly how he had been found out. Amara Whittaker was looking at her hands. She was looking at them the way Harrison had asked her to look at them, with the small, steady attention of a child who had been given a task and who intended to complete it correctly. She did not look up at Douglas Merrick. She did not know in that moment that he had just seen her, though she would later come to understand that he had, and she would come to understand what it had cost him to see her. Harrison spoke. The second thing I would like you to understand, Douglas, is that the person who told me what you said on the telephone this morning is not going to be identified in any proceeding that follows from this meeting. Her name is not going to appear in any filing. Her mother's name is not going to appear in any filing. If at any point in the next several years I learn that you have attempted, through counsel or through any other channel, to identify the source of the information that ended your career this morning, I will spend whatever it takes from what remains of my fortune to make certain that the last chapter of your life is spent in circumstances considerably less comfortable than the ones you had arranged for yourself. Do you understand me? Douglas Merrick understood him. He did not speak. The third thing I would like you to understand is that you are going to stand up now, and you are going to walk out of this room through the main door, and you are going to go directly to your office, where Ms. Kwan and Mr. Sutherland and two members of the New York office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who were called at 9:51, and who are at this moment arriving on the executive floor, are going to accompany you while you gather your personal effects. You are not going to touch your computer. You are not going to touch your telephone. You are not going to speak to any member of the finance team on your way out of the building. You are going to leave the building through the lobby in the ordinary way with your head held up, because I am not going to give the people who work for this company the story of watching you let out in restraints. That courtesy is not for you, Douglas. It is for them. They have worked here for a long time and they do not deserve the memory of that image. Do you understand me? Yes, Harrison. It was the last thing Douglas Merrick would ever say to Harrison Vale. He stood. He left the closing binder on the walnut. He left the coffee cup precisely 3 inches to the right of where the binder had been. He walked the length of the room without looking at anyone, and he opened the main door, and he walked out into the anteroom where Corinne Delaney was standing at her desk, with the same pleasant meeting-room face she had been maintaining for 24 years, and where 2 men in dark suits with the small, quiet bearing of federal agents were waiting for him beside the elevator. The main door closed behind him. Harrison Vale stood behind his chair at the head of the table for a long moment. He looked at the sealed binder in front of him. He looked at the modified binder in front of the empty chair. He looked at Priya Kwan and Nigel Sutherland and the 2 outside directors and the 2 younger executives from corporate development, whose names he now, in the strange clarity of the moment, remembered. Then he turned and looked at the girl. "Amara," he said quietly, "you may look up now." Amara Whitaker looked up. She looked at Harrison across the length of the walnut and she did not smile, because she was not the kind of child who smiled at compliments from adults she did not yet know whether she could trust. But Harrison saw something small and steady move behind her eyes that he understood, in the small, precise way that he had understood a great many things that morning, to be the beginning of the trust. "Thank you," Harrison said. He did not say for what. She knew. He turned to Nadine Whitaker. "Nadine, I would like to buy your daughter lunch. I would like to buy you lunch as well. I would like to do it in the small private dining room on the 43rd floor in about 90 minutes once Ms. Kwan and Mr. Sutherland and I have finished the considerable amount of work that this morning has just created for us. Would that be acceptable?" Nadine Whitaker looked at her daughter. "Yes, Mr. Vale," she said. "That would be acceptable." What happened in the months that followed moved with the patient, deliberate weight that only very large companies and very careful lawyers can bring to a matter that has been quietly building for 19 years. Douglas Merrick was indicted on the second Tuesday in September. The indictment ran to 183 pages and named 7 defendants, of whom Douglas was the third listed, and it described in the small, careful language of federal prosecutors a scheme that had begun in the summer of 2019 and had, over the course of 6.5 years, diverted an amount of money that Harrison Vale would eventually be told, in a private meeting with the head of internal audit and the general counsel, came to just over $440 million. The money had moved through a chain of intermediary vehicles registered in 3 jurisdictions, and it had been placed, with the small elegance that white-collar criminals sometimes brought to their work, in a portfolio of assets that Priya Kwan and her team were able, over the following 11 months, to recover in almost its entirety. Douglas Merrick pleaded guilty in the spring to 9 of the 23 charges against him. He was sentenced to 14 years in a federal facility. He was 62 years old at the time of sentencing. Harrison did not attend the hearing. Charles Ashford and Marguerite Carlson resigned from the board of Vail Industries on the same day in October, in short letters that Harrison read once and filed. Neither of them was ever charged with any offense. Harrison had believed for several weeks in the autumn that they might be. In the end, the evidence did not support it, and Harrison had learned very young that a man who pursued suspicions past the edge of the evidence became, in time, a different kind of man than the one he wanted to be. He let them go. He replaced them with two people whose names he had not previously known, on the recommendation of a search firm he had never previously used. The Halbrook Logistics acquisition closed in November at the correct cap on page 11, and the terminals on the Gulf Coast performed, over the following 3 years, exactly as Harrison had projected they would. Nadine Whittaker did not remain in the Executive Services Division. She was promoted, in a small ceremony that Harrison arranged personally in the private dining room on the 43rd floor, to a role in operations that had been designed around her particular set of skills, and that came with a salary that allowed her to move, in the spring of the following year, from the small apartment 11 miles from the tower to a house in a neighborhood with better schools. She continued to iron her daughter's blouses at 6 o'clock in the morning. She said, when Harrison asked her once whether she would like help with that particular part of her mornings, that ironing her daughter's blouses was not the part of her mornings she wanted help with. Amara Whittaker was enrolled in a small private school in the city that Harrison had supported quietly for many years, in a scholarship program that had, until that autumn, not existed. She took to it slowly, in the way that careful children take to any new room. By the end of her second year, she was reading at a level 3 grades above her own, and she had asked her mother, in a small conversation in the kitchen of the new house, whether she might one day become a lawyer, because she had been thinking for some time about the way certain words in certain rooms could change the shape of what happened to people who were not in those rooms. Harrison Vail lived for 9 more years after the morning the girl spoke to him in the boardroom. He spent many of those years quietly reorganizing the company he had built so that no one person in it, ever again, would be permitted to prepare a 1-page summary of a closing binder for the founder. He hired Amara Whittaker as an intern in the general counsel's office in the summer of her 17th year. He attended her high school graduation. He attended her college graduation. He did not live to attend her graduation from law school, but he had established, 3 years before he died, a fund at the school she attended that ensured she would never in her life need to accept work she did not want in order to pay for the education she was pursuing. There are stories we tell about the great boardrooms of the world. We say that the men who sit at the heads of the long tables know what happens in their rooms. We say that empires protect themselves, that power sees its own shadows, that the founders of great companies are impossible to deceive inside the buildings that carry their names. It is not true. The truths of those buildings are known almost always by the people who refill the water pitchers and empty the trash cans and walk through the marble corridors in quiet shoes. The people who see what the men at the tables do not see. The people who are trained from the youngest ages to be invisible in rooms that were not built for them. Learn the names of the children of the people who bring you your coffee. The next time someone small and quiet stands beside the credenza in your own boardroom and tells you, in a voice barely above a whisper, that you should not trust the man in the gray suit, set down your pen. Listen. The bravest voice in any room is almost never the loudest one. And sometimes all it takes to set right a wrong that has been waiting 19 years for the light is 4 words spoken softly by a girl who refused to walk past. If this story moved you, please tap the like button. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded to listen to the quiet voices in the rooms of their own lives, and subscribe to the channel so the next story finds you. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and remember always to look up at the small people standing at the edges of your day. You never know which one might tell you the truth that everyone else has missed.